I've already spoken in a previous video about 4Q Psalm F, also known as 4Q88. This manuscript contains the only preserved reading of Psalm 22:17 from the scrolls that were discovered at Qumran. Now, Psalm 22:17 has also been preserved in a manuscript from Nahal Hever, as I've talked about in a previous video, but 4Q Psalm F is the only reading of this verse that we have from the Qumran scrolls. That's pretty disappointing because there were a lot of biblical texts discovered at Qumran, including multiple manuscripts of the Psalms. Now, I talked in my previous video about some of the challenges in trying to reconstruct the last line of this fragment. Above this line, there are several words from Psalm 22:17 that can be read without much difficulty. Here's kelavim, dogs. Here's adat, assembly. And here's the mem and resh from meraim, evildoers. None of these readings is in dispute, so we're most interested in the final line of this manuscript. In particular, the second word of this line. Should we read here, ka'ari, like a lion, or karu, they dug? Inquiring minds would like to know. Sadly, as you can see, the manuscript is severely damaged at precisely this point. At first glance, the damage may seem so serious that reconstructing this text may seem like a pointless endeavor. We can only see the top parts of these letters, and then the letters over here only survive in tiny ink marks. Nevertheless, the more I've studied this manuscript, the more I've become convinced that we can actually reconstruct it with relative certainty. In my previous video, I offered kind of a rough attempt at reconstructing this text. I'm still convinced that I got all the characters right. The characters in my reconstruction are the same ones that were proposed by the editors of the manuscript in the 16th volume of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes, published by Oxford in 2000. I'm no longer happy with the way I drew these characters, however. Having spent more time studying this scribe's handwriting, I think I can do a much better job reconstructing how this line would have originally looked. Before I get started, though, let me just give a quick word of warning about something I came across on the internet. It's this image here. Some person apparently assumed that fragment 2 in the Leon Levy digital collection is the same fragment 2 in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume. He then tried fitting these two fragments together, and this is what he came up with. When I first came across this, I thought, wow, I haven't seen this before. I wonder if these two fragments could actually go together. Well, that was an ill-founded hope, because the editors had already determined where this fragment goes, and it's definitely not here. If we were to arrange these fragments properly, we would have to place it in an entirely separate column from fragment 1. Fragment 7 in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume, or fragment 2 in the Leon Levy digital collection, actually goes in column 3. So you can see that it's not supposed to go underneath fragment 1. It's actually a text from Psalm 107, so it's not even the same psalm. But this is just another illustration of why I wish the folks that put together the Leon Levy digital collection would have stuck with the same numbering system as the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes, at least as far as that might have been possible. What's even more confusing to people is that fragment 2 of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume doesn't even seem to be available in the Leon Levy digital library. I'm not sure why that's the case, but don't get confused by that. As I said, fragment 2 of that library is actually fragment 7 in volume 16 of the DJD series. Here is fragment 2 of the DJD volume. This is the fragment that connects with fragment 1, not this other fragment 2 from the Leon Levy digital collection. Here are some other photos that I personally took of the plate photo in the DJD volume. I took these with my cell phone, and the photos in the volume were pretty small, So you can understand why the resolution here is at a very low quality. All right, let's go back to this photo. You can definitely make out yadai, my hands, and you can also see the vav and the resh on veraglai. It's not quite so obvious what happens after that, though. Judging by how this text reads in the other extant manuscripts, which read veraglai, we would expect the next letter to be a gimel. And here's how the scribe wrote his gimels. So is this little bit of ink all that remains of that gimel? Well, I don't think that's how the editors of this manuscript interpreted the evidence. I say that because in their proposed reconstruction, they don't put any markings over the gimel to indicate that this character was difficult to read or had to be conjectured. So apparently they felt that they could confidently read the gimel here. This means that they must have read this character as the gimel and this little piece of ink as part of that same gimel. It's located over here because the fragment is torn. Anyway, it's really fragment 1 that we're most concerned about. So let's focus on it. Once again, here's that reconstruction that I offered in an earlier video. In the present video, I'm going to offer what I think is a better reconstruction. So let's just start this whole thing over from scratch. Here's the image that you'll find in the Leon Levy Digital Library. And here's the photo that's given in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume. Notice that in this photo, you can see 3 little ink marks. Here again are the photos that I took with my phone. And this is one that I made with a scanner at the library. And this one, again, is a photo from the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume, but it's larger than what's printed in that volume, and so it's much easier to work with. I actually grabbed it from one of Kipp Davis's videos, but I've seen it on other people's videos as well, so I'm not sure where people are getting it from. Maybe it comes from some software program like Accordance. I don't know, I don't have that program, so I don't even know if they have photos. But wherever it came from, it's clearly the same photo that you find in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume. And it's no less clear that this photo differs in certain respects from the photo that you find in the Leon Levy Digital Library. As you can see, there's now only 1 ink mark that's visible. The 2 to the right of it seem to have deteriorated or broken off. Anyway, I'll come back to these ink marks in just a bit. But for now, let's focus on the first part of this poorly preserved line. Judging by what comes before it, we know what this word is supposed to be. It's supposed to be hikifuni. And even though we only have the top portions of each letter in this word, it's not too difficult to make out that this is exactly what the scribe had written. Here's the he, the kof, the yod, the pei, the nun, and another yod. So here's how I've reconstructed each of the characters, based on what's still preserved in the line, and based on how the scribe wrote these same characters at other places in the 4Q Psalm F manuscript. I've cut and pasted some of those characters onto this slide so that you can see how I came up with my reconstruction. Now, if you look at the bottom of this fragment, you'll see a light line running basically all the way across. This is just because it's the edge of the fragment, and so the ink has peeled off. It's obviously not because the scribe lifted up his pen. The ink for each character would have originally extended straight through this now inkless line, so don't let that throw you off. I was happy to find some really useful examples from elsewhere in 4Q Psalm F for each of the characters that we're assuming to have once been written here. Note especially the nun and yod combination. The scribe who wrote this manuscript would apparently join these 2 characters together, forming what looks a bit like a capital U in the English language. Here's another example. And here's an example where the nun is followed by something other than a yod. I don't remember now what that other character was, but you can see that he has once again joined the nun with that other character. And then here are some pays. I've based my pay mostly on this one and this one, although I probably could have based it on one or more of the others just as easily. And I trust that you can see how I've used some of these other examples to reconstruct the other characters. Here's a slide with many more images from 4Q Psalm F that contain other characters in this line. You may find this collage helpful if you're trying to come up with your own reconstruction. All right, well, thus far at least, there's really nothing about my reconstruction that should seem controversial. Someone may think that the characters ought to be reconstructed a bit differently, perhaps, but virtually everyone would agree that the word here is hikifuni, just as we would have expected. All that's really in dispute here is what follows. Should we read the next word as ka'ari, like a lion, or karu, they dug, spelled either with or without an aleph? In my previous video, I played a clip from Kipp Davis, where he really rips into Peter Flint for claiming that the text originally read karu, kaf resh vav.
So this is the other fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the verse 16 in the English, verse 17 in the Hebrew, the like a lion, my hands and my feet, is down here on the bottom.
Wow, it's a scribble.
Peter Flint has actually read Keru here somewhere.
Are you kidding?
Which me? I'm not. It's actually
he decided that's what it means.
It's crazy. So, and I'm going to suggest that it's nonsense that you can even clearly see the kof or the resh to say nothing of whether this is a vav or a yod.
Professor Flint wrote his own dissertation on the Psalm scrolls from Qumran at the University of Notre Dame, and he was the editor of all the Qumran K4 Psalms in Discoveries in the Judean Desert, or DJD, Volume 16. This is the official publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He also edited and published this manuscript from Nachal Hever, claiming that it attested to an original reading that predicted the crucifixion of Jesus maybe centuries in advance. The only other manuscript in the Dead Sea Scrolls which preserves Psalm 22:17 or verse 16 in the English is 4Q Psalms F, fragments 1 and 2, lines 24 to 25. In this fragment, which preserves all of 2 microscopic traces of ink belonging to the controversial reading, he wrote the following. What he's saying here is that the original reading, they pierced my hands and feet, which he identifies from 2 microscopic traces of ink, is confirmed by 3 medieval witnesses, later editions, the Septuagint, and the Nachal Hever Psalm Scroll. This reading, behind the authorized sanction of its official publication in DJD, has become universally accepted within academic discussions of this passage.
Davis talks as if Peter Flint was single-handedly responsible for proposing and championing the Karu readings in 4Q Psalm F and the other manuscript from Nachal Hever. I'll explain in a moment why this is so misleading and false. Davis obviously has little regard for Flint, even though it sounds like Flint was at least largely responsible for helping Davis get his own academic career off the ground. He now thinks that Flint was something of a con artist, and so he thinks that Flint's role in editing the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes ought to raise some serious red flags. Flint was an evangelical Christian, after all, and we all know that evangelicals are incapable of dealing honestly with evidence, at least when it impinges on their strongly held beliefs. Unlike atheists who don't have any strongly held beliefs, but are completely neutral. And so, just look at this fragment. The manuscript is utterly unreadable. There's no way for anyone to determine what the scribe wrote over here. Flint may have been a respected scholar, but he was really just another hack apologist, and his proposed reading here of Kaf Resh Vav is laughable.
It's It's crazy.
Well, that's Kipp Davis's perspective anyway. But notice, Volume 16 of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series was jointly edited by many different scholars. 4Q Psalm F was edited not just by Peter Flint, but also by Patrick W. Skian and Eugene Ulrich. And these two other scholars were definitely not evangelicals. Skian was a Roman Catholic priest, and Ulrich taught at Notre Dame, a Roman Catholic university. Davis may respond by suggesting that Skian and Ulrich were no less theologically motivated than Flint, due to their Roman Catholic beliefs. But I'm quite sure that their editorial decisions were subjected to further peer review, at least by other members of the editorial team. So are we supposed to think that all of these other scholars were also just acting as hack Christian apologists? Well, here's the list of all the editors that contributed to Volume 16 of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume. Frank Moore Cross was hardly an evangelical or Roman Catholic. Emmanuel Tove is a Jew, and so on. So this whole approach by Davis of trying to cast doubt on the Kafresh Vav reconstruction on the grounds that it came from Peter Flint, who was really just some kind of hack apologist, seems pretty glib and unfair in my opinion, especially since Flint is dead now and can't defend himself. I would argue that there are two things that are quite clear on this matter. First, contrary to what Kipp Davis suggests, the Karu reading didn't just find its way into the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes because of Peter Flint. Other scholars were involved in this editorial judgment as well. Second, this editorial judgment was grounded in actual evidence, not apologetics. The first point doesn't need to be proven. It's a simple fact. I've even corresponded with one of the contributing editors to Volume 16 and got the confirmation that what I'm saying here is accurate. The second point is something that I intend to demonstrate in this video. I'll be arguing that in 4Q Psalm F, the readings of Kaf Aleph Resh Yod, like a lion, and Kaf Aleph Resh Vav, the longer spelling of they dug, simply don't fit. And that Kaf Resh Vav, the short spelling of they dug, is really the only viable way to reconstruct this text. Okay, so let's look again at some photos of 4Q Psalm F Fragment 1. Here's the photo from the Leon Levy Digital Library. Remember that there are, or at least were, 3 little ink marks at the bottom of this fragment, at least when the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume was published. You can see those in this other photo. These lousy photos at the bottom are a couple that I took. This one's the scan that I made in the library, and this one's one of the photos that I took on my cell phone. These were both made from the plate photo in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume. So they're basically photos of photos, and they're pretty unhelpful at this resolution. I only pasted them in here because I wanted to make sure that the other photo lined up with what was in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume. It does line up, so that's all good. And it still has 3 and not just 2 of those little ink marks. In the photo from the Leon Levy Digital Library, the 3rd dot is still visible, but the 2 dots to the right of it are strangely missing. Presumably, this is because the manuscript experienced some further degradation after it was photographed for the DJD volume. So even though I'm going to be using as my main photograph this one from the Leon Levy Digital Library, mainly just because it's such a good photograph, I'm also going to take advantage of this earlier photo and use it to restore those missing ink marks as best I can. So here it is. Now, let's see if we can figure out what letters these 3 ink marks were originally a part of. I'll start with the first 2 dots. I take these to be the 2 upticks on what was once a cough. The editors in trying to find a good parallel to what's going on here, point us to chokmatam, which is found in column 3, line 18 of this manuscript. This word is from Psalm 107, verse 27. You can see here how the cough flares up a bit on the left, and it also has a slight incline on the top right. But I think there are other coughs in this manuscript that would better illustrate what's going on in the place in this manuscript that we're considering. Look, for example, at this cough, or this one, or this one. This final cough seems like an especially good match, and the same could be said of this final cough. There are also some bets that do the same kind of thing, with these upticks on the top left and the top right of the letter. Now you might say, well, so what? Those are bets, not coughs. But if you look at the way this scribe writes his bets and coughs, they're almost identical. All that really distinguishes the two letters is how the base is drawn. The base on a cough will often, I think, drop down farther than what you see on a bet. Also, a bet will usually have a little knob sticking out on the right side. A cough, by contrast, will be smooth on the bottom right or even curve in a bit. Even these minor differences, though, are often hard to detect or simply not present. So yeah, the bets and coughs in this manuscript are virtually indistinguishable. So I think that by looking at how the scribe wrote his bets, we can find some further rationale for interpreting these two upticks as the remains of a cough. Now, I suppose someone could argue that the ink mark on the right was the uptick on the top left rather than the top right of the cough. But that would leave us with very little space, I think, between the yod on hikifuni and this cough. And this wouldn't really fit with the scribe's writing style, because he's quite consistent in putting a little extra space between his words. You can see that in some of these photos. Just look at all these examples. Well, there are some exceptions, though. Notice here that there are some places where there's not a whole lot of space. And on this fragment, the spacing is pretty minimal. And on fragments 1 and 2, the ones that we're most concerned about, there are several places where the scribe put no extra spaces between the words. For the sake of the argument, then, let's go ahead and pull this cough over here and see what happens. There. Now, again, in my opinion, this puts the cough too close to the previous yod, but I suppose it's a possible reconstruction. So let's keep going. The next thing we need to do is figure out how to interpret the second uptick. Is this supposed to be part of an aleph? Well, I don't see how that's going to work, because that means we're going to have to squeeze in the aleph before the letter that's represented by this next ink mark. That letter would, of course, be a resh. And so this ink mark would have to be the top left uptick on that resh. So watch when I try to squeeze all of that into this small amount of space. Here I've copied and pasted a few examples of alephs from this manuscript. And now, using those other alephs as a guide, there, I've drawn in an aleph. As you can see, there's really no way, at least with the aleph drawn like this, to squeeze a resh into the remaining space. Even if I were to draw this aleph a lot narrower, like this, something still doesn't look right. Let me try to make the cough a little bit smaller and see how that looks. I can't move it any farther to the right because it needs to line up with this uptick here. And then the arm at the bottom needs to extend out farther to the left than that uptick, because that's how this scribe writes his coughs, with the arm at the bottom extending out farther to the left. Okay, now let's add the resh. There. This is the very best that I could do with this option. But no matter what I do, something just doesn't look right. Compare the size, the thickness, and the spacing of these letters with those of Hikifuni. The differences are very apparent. I realized that this scribe wasn't terribly consistent in his writing style. Some of his letters and words are written larger than others, and the spacing between his letters aren't always the same, even when they're written on the same lines. That said, I don't think that he was this inconsistent. By the way, don't judge his consistency by this final mem or this final tet, because he often writes those letters quite large. Anyway, even if it could be argued that he was this inconsistent, let's say on a few occasions, I don't think we should be trying to reconstruct the text based on what's possible. Rather, we should be trying to reconstruct it based on what's most plausible. If we take that approach, it looks to me like there's just too much of a stylistic difference between Hikifuni and the word that we're trying to reconstruct to the left of it. So I think the only real option here is to interpret these first two ink marks as the two upticks on a cough. All right, so let's move it back over to where we had it originally. Now, it could still be argued that the next letter is not a resh, but an aleph. So let's see how that would look. Here again are some sample alephs. There. I've tried to insert an aleph to fit into this space. The problem now is that the scribe didn't write his alephs like this. In fact, I doubt that there were any ancient scribes who wrote their alephs like this. But let's limit ourselves here to the 4Q Psalm F manuscript. I can't find a single example in this manuscript where the high point on the top left extends higher than the arm that extends up on the right. So if the letter after the cough had been an aleph, we would surely expect to see an ink mark not just over here, but over here as well. Thus, I don't consider this a viable reconstruction of the text. All right, let's imagine now that the cough was not immediately followed by an aleph, but by a resh. In that case, the third ink mark would have to be regarded as the uptick on that resh. So let's see how that works. There. That fits remarkably well. It leaves just the right amount of space between each letter, and it fits very well with how the scribe wrote his reshes, since he always wrote them with high upticks on the top left. You can see that from this slide. Here I've copied and pasted lots of examples of reshes, as well as vavs from different locations in 4Q Psalm F. Based on these examples, and based on what we've seen about the available space on this line, it strikes me as completely plausible to understand this third ink mark as the uptick on what was once a resh. And so, I would have to agree with the editors of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volume that this word is best reconstructed as kaf, resh, vav. In other words, as the defective spelling of karu, they dug. Now, this yod in Hikifuni and the yod in karu could be reconstructed in a variety of ways. This scribe was notoriously inconsistent in how he wrote both of these characters. Moreover, it doesn't seem that he differentiated between these two characters. So you could probably use an example of a vav to reconstruct a yod, or vice versa. At any rate, none of this impacts how we understand the text. I should also mention that the height of each character is uncertain, since the bottom part of this line has not been preserved. I've done my best to use the characters in the other lines of this fragment to guide me in how tall I reconstructed the characters on this final line. I wasn't so careful at first, though, and so I made them too tall. Then I shrunk them down a bit, but that still didn't seem sufficient, so I had to shrink them down again. All of this was a major hassle, because whenever I would shrink one slide down, I had to shrink all the other ones down as well. And I don't have Photoshop, so it wasn't such a simple process. I actually had to create all these slides in PowerPoint, which is not exactly designed for artistic projects. Now, it might be possible to reduce the height a little bit more, but I'm pretty satisfied with what you see here. Now, the Kaf Resh Vav reading is also attested in several medieval manuscripts, as I've discussed in a previous video. Here's a photo of one of those manuscripts. If you consult the apparatus in Kennicott's Vitas Testamentum Hebraicum, you'll find several other manuscripts listed that attest this reading as well. Okay, now, even if you agree with me about the Kaf and the Resh, you may still find it hard to accept that I, or anyone else, can determine that the next letter was a Vav. After all, there's nothing that remains of this letter, not even a small ink mark. Thankfully, this isn't as big of a problem as you might imagine. In view of all the other Hebrew manuscripts that exist with Psalm 22:17, there are really only two options here. The next letter had to have been either a Yod or a Vav. And of those two options, the Yod has to be ruled out because Kaf Resh Yod isn't a word, at least not one that would fit into the context of this psalm. Hence, a Vav is really the only viable option here, at least if the first two letters are Kaf Resh. Right, so that leaves us with Hikifuni Karu. And if we join this fragment with fragment 2, we can further reconstruct the text as Hikifuni Karu Yadai Veraglai, which we would translate as they, speaking of the assembly of evildoers, have surrounded me. They dug my hands and my feet. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please like and share.